Hello again and welcome back. In this video, we're going to be learning some more Greek vocabulary, this time words having to do with working and building. There are a few general words for action and ability in Greek. The first is prasso, I do or I practice. Notice that the double sigma at the end of the stem here, when it meets the sigma tense marker of the aorist or the future, becomes a xi. And so the first aorist form is apraxa, and the future is praxo. The related noun is hepraxis, which means an act or a deed or activity, and can also be a way of acting or pattern of acting. This is a third declension noun of the polis type, and so its genitive, for example, will be tes praxeos. Another important word here is dunamai. This means I can or I am able, and can also mean I am strong. It's a middle-only verb, so it doesn't appear in the present active voice. And the second person singular is irregular here. This is one of the rare cases where instead of an eta and iota subscript, we have the theoretical psi ending, sigma alpha iota, showing up for the middle voice, second person singular. We also have an unusual alpha connecting vowel instead of the usual omicron and epsilon that shows up in the present forms of this. So we get dunamitha instead of dunamitha, dunastha instead of dunestha, dunantai instead of dunantai, etc. This alpha lengthens to an eta in front of the sigma tense marker of the aorist. So, for example, the first person singular aorist form is going to be adunesamein. When we think about working, in particular, ergadzamai is the primary verb here. It means I work or I labor. It can also be I make or do or I perform a task. The first aorist here is ergasamein, and there are two things happening in this form. The first, remember, is that the initial epsilon lengthens to an eta because it absorbs the augment. The second thing is that the zeta at the end of the stem, ergads, is absorbed by the sigma tense marker. And so instead of ergadsamein, we just have ergasamein. And this is another middle-only verb. The derived noun is ta ergon, which means work or labor or deed. And this is the form from which we get the English word ergonomic. Nomos at the end having to do with rules, and ergo having to do with ergon, work. So this is rules for good action, or rules for working well. Ha ergates, then, is a worker or a laborer. And we see here the familiar ace ending that's often used for a person practicing an occupation or an activity. This is a masculine first declension noun. And take note that there's no sigma in the middle here. It's not ergastes, it's ergates. Why is that important? Because the word for workshop or workplace is ta ergasterion, and that sigma appears in front of the tau. This is a familiar ending as well, the terion ending, for places where an activity is carried out. So ergates and ergasterion are good examples of the way words for a practitioner and the place of practice are often derived from a word for some kind of action. When we're thinking of completing our action, we'll think of the noun ta telos, which means end, finish, goal, or completion. This is a third declension noun of the genos type, and so, for example, the genitive will be telus. The related verb is teleo, which means I finish, or I fulfill, or I accomplish, or carry out. This is a little unusual in that the epsilon at the end of the stem does not lengthen before the sigma tense indicator in the aorist or future. Instead of etelesa, we have etelesa in the first aorist, and instead of teleso, we have the future form teleso. A related adjective is teleos. Just notice the iota added to the stem there. It's not teleos, but teleos. And the feminine form is teleie and teleon in the neuter. This means that something is complete or perfect, but perfect not necessarily in the sense of being flawless, but perfect in the sense of being whole or complete. There's a related verb then that is almost synonymous with teleo, which is teleao. Again, it means I complete or accomplish, but has added emphasis on being mature or on making something perfect. The omicron here at the end of the stem lengthens in front of the sigma tense marker, and so the first aorist is eteleosa, and the future is teleoso. If we want to talk about building, one useful word is oikodomos, which means builder or architect. And notice that it has the word oikos at the start, helping you to remember that this is about making houses. The related verb is oikodomeo, which means I build, an epsilon contract verb. And one of the common materials out of which houses would be built would be holithos, stone or rock. This is the word from which we get English terms like monolithic and paleolithic. And most walls actually were not made of solid stone, but they would be made of concrete faced with brick or pieces of stone set into the concrete. And in fact, the ancient Romans were among the first to really use concrete heavily as a building material. But stone or brick was pretty well consistently part of the facing. Tautechos is a wall. And notice that this ends in os, but it's neuter. And that's because it's a genos type third declension noun. So the genitive form in the singular is genus, and the real stem is gene. Ta themelion then is the foundation. One of the strange things about oikodomeo, I build, is the way the augment interacts with the diphthong at the beginning of the word. So if we want to make an aorist form, for example, which is one of the augmented forms of oikodomeo, we need to add the augment epsilon onto the beginning. And so it needs to combine not just with the omicron, but with the whole oi diphthong that starts the word. And one indication that we're going to have to combine it with the whole diphthong is the location of the breathing mark in oikodomeo. Notice it's over the iota, not over the omicron. And so that whole diphthong is being treated like one sound, and the augment, epsilon, has to combine with that whole sound. When we combine those, the result is O, an omega with a smooth breathing mark, but notice that it has an iota subscript. The iota from oi has slid under the letter. It's no longer pronounced, but it's there as part of the spelling. So the first aorist, first person singular form of oikodomeo is okodomesa. Okodomesa. Notice the A has become O, and the iota is still there as a subscript, but we don't pronounce it. Just remember that there are some aorist forms outside the indicative mood that, because they're not indicative, don't have the augment. So participles, for example, won't have the augment. That means that we won't have okodomesas as the first aorist participle. We'll have oikodomesas. It's a little bit tricky to type this omega with the smooth breathing and the iota subscript underneath. If you're lucky enough to be typing in Linux, all you have to do is type the dead keys for each mark, for the smooth breathing mark, then the dead key for the iota subscript, and then your letter, and all three get combined together. In both Windows and OS X, though, the Mac operating system, instead of combining and piling up the marks, we have to have a separate dead key that combines those two, the smooth breathing mark with the iota subscript. And in both OS X and Windows, that's the dead key apostrophe, but while you type the apostrophe, you have to hold down the Alt-GR key. Now, many keyboards don't have an Alt-GR key. So if you don't have one, the operating system treats your right hand Alt key the same way. So if you don't have an Alt-GR key, just hold down your right Alt key, press apostrophe, and then press the V key, which is the normal key for an omega, and you end up with the omega with both the smooth breathing mark and the iota subscript. In agriculture, we have the verb spero, which means to sow or scatter seed. The first aorist here is espera, and notice that the sigma tense marker is absorbed by the liquid consonant at the end of the stem there, the rho. And so instead of espersa, it's espera. But that's fairly common with liquid verbs. The future, too, is spero. And the only indication that we're dealing with a future form here is that the stem changes from spare with the iota to sper, just with the epsilon rho. Tosperma is what spero acts on. This is the seed. This is a third declension noun of the pneumatos type, and so the genitive, for example, is spermatos. On the other hand, you might work in a vineyard or an orchard and so talk about toxylon. This is a word meaning wood or tree, and the same word is used for the object, a tree, and for the derived material, wood, if you're working with wooden planks or something like that. This is an interesting pattern that we see also in the word alaya, which, if you remember, can mean either olive tree or the thing you get from the olive tree, the olive fruit. Metalsmithing is another common form of work in the ancient world. Hachalkos means just copper or brass or bronze, and there wasn't a strong distinction made between those different metals. But this can also mean a copper coin, and so by extension can mean money. The adjective made of copper or made of bronze is chalkus, chalke, chalkun, and you'll notice that the nominative masculine and neuter singular are a little bit irregular. You have the omicron upsilon diphthong instead of just the regular os or on. These forms are a little bit easier to remember if you think of them as being contracted from chalketos and chalkeon. And the epsilon and omicron, when they meet, become the u diphthong. But the other endings of this chalkus adjective are perfectly regular. So in the genitive, for example, we have chalku, chalkes, and chalku. Tachalkion then is a copper object, a copper vessel or pot or a kettle. And to forge or work metal is chalkuo. Hachalkus then is the blacksmith or bronze smith or metal worker. And this is a a noun of the hiereus type, third declension. So the genitive singular, for example, will be kalkeos. Often one of the things that comes up when we're talking about workers is debt and payment. So ophelo means I owe, I am obligated, or I ought. Notice that the initial omicron here, when we get into the aorist, will be lengthened by the augment. Again, the augment is absorbed by the omicron, but it lengthens to an omega. So we have the first aorist form ophelesa. One of the other things you'll notice about this form ophelesa is that the addition of an eta in front of the sigma tense marker, as if this were a contract verb, opheleo. But it's not, it's just ophelo. So in the other forms, don't stick an epsilon in front of the ending. Misthao means I hire. And again, the omicron at the end of the stem for this contract verb lengthens to omega in things like the aorist tense. And so this will be, in the first aorist, misthosa. Homisthios is a worker or wage laborer. And it's important to notice the iota in there, because homisthos, without the iota, is the actual wage or payment or a reward. It's interesting that several of Jesus' parables feature homisthios, or hoi misthioi. And Jesus can even, in Matthew's Gospel, talk about the kingdom of God as a misthos, a reward, or almost payment, which raises lots of theological questions around Matthew's understanding of salvation. Hikanos, hikane, hikanon is an adjective meaning sufficient or appropriate, and also can mean considerable in the sense of a considerable amount of something or many. And hopefully one's misthos is hikanos, is appropriate or sufficient for the work that one has done. A few other related words here. Hechreia means need or necessity. Chraamai is the related verb that means I use or I make use of. And the alpha of this contract verb lengthens to eta again in the first aorist form, echreisamein. Hehupomone means patience or endurance. And this comes up a fair amount when people are talking about work, because physical labor was considered extremely painful and onerous. On a different note, Tosabbaton is the seventh day of the week, or the Sabbath, when Jews would not work. It can also, by extension, mean a period of 7 days or a week. Sometimes the plural form tasabbata is used for a single Sabbath day, too. So notice that that's not necessarily Sabbaths. It can just be the Sabbath. And the Sabbath, Tosabbaton, is one of the cultural practices that really distinguished Jews from the surrounding society in Greek and Roman cities, because most people didn't take a day off of work every seventh day. Workers would get a day off on religious festival days, but there wasn't a regular cycle like the cycle of Jewish weeks. Finally, skandalizo means I make stumble or I trip. And the first aorist here is eskandalisa, for the familiar reason that the zeta at the end of the stem is absorbed by the sigma tense marker. And so instead of eskandalizsa, it's eskandalisa. And this verb obviously comes into English as scandalize, which metaphorically means to make somebody stumble over something shocking.